Welcome back. How can you tell that the off season's on the way? Right here. So I went through and I put this together yesterday, and it took a long time. So I'm aware that people are just gonna go to the end, get mad about where teams are at. But I'm gonna explain this first off. So this year the power rankings were 16 weeks, and I thought it was great that it was going to be 16 weeks. I thought that's perfect. So I got 8 weeks here for the first half, 8 weeks for the second half, and then an overall. So next season, I intend to try to make sure that it's an even number of power rankings, so I can split it in half and do an overall again. Because it's interesting to look at where teams were at during the regular season. And again, all I did for this was what was their average, and then what was their average. So first half, second half, and at the end of the season. This is what I was doing yesterday when I had any kind of downtime. I was doing that, and I was doing some cleaning up and organizing in here because we're getting ready for the off season. So that means massive boards with a lot of magnets and me changing things around a little bit on the set. I do that every off season. All right, so number 31. And this is really interesting. Number 31 for the first half was Anaheim. All right, number 31 for the second half was Anaheim. Now the surprise is number 31 for overall is Anaheim. By average number, Anaheim ends up at the bottom. And it was a rough year. That's why I'm wearing Ducks, because it was a rough year. And kudos to Ducks fans that gutted it out and watched every game. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But the fact that this is the same across the board, honestly, it surprised me. I knew Anaheim was down near the bottom most of the year, and that's really what it was. I think the highest they got all year was 27th. 27th or 28th. It was just a really... So if you feel like, wow, I feel like the Ducks might have had the most miserable season, you could be right. Number 30. Now, in the first half of the season, that was Detroit. Detroit had a very rough first half of the season, and so, yeah, they end up 30th overall. The second half of the season, that's where you find Buffalo. Okay, so no surprise to find Buffalo there. And in the overall picture, it's Buffalo. So Buffalo ends up being 30th, and Detroit 30th in the first half of the season during the first 8. But Detroit's notably higher in the second half, though not quite in the overall. Now, 29th in the first half of the season, the 29th rated team is Ottawa. Ottawa had that miserable start to the season, so it definitely left them further behind. And if I had done 17 weeks of power rankings, if there'd been 9 here and 8 here, Ottawa may very well have been lower down. Because again, they had that really rough start to the season. Number 29 in the second half of the season is Columbus. Columbus, their overall average, 29th for the second half of the season. So again, rough second half. 29th overall, Detroit. So yeah, it's a different magnet. There's 2 magnets on this board that are going to be different than the others, and it drives me nuts. I want all 93 magnets to be of the same variety, and so just don't call attention to it, please. Thank you. But yeah, Detroit's 29th overall. So no real surprise here with Anaheim, Buffalo, and Detroit, though the order they're in might surprise people because Buffalo's not at the bottom. Number 28 in the first half of the season was Buffalo. So again, not really a huge surprise to see Buffalo there, although some may have expected them to be lower than 28th. But they did have some good runs here and there, and there were times where I had to bump them up because they were playing well. They just had that one really long losing streak. Insanely long losing streak. Number 28 in the second half of the season, Detroit. So there you go. They go from 30th to 28th. Not too shabby. Overall, 28th, Columbus. So, there you go. It's the same teams cycling through at the bottom. And for Columbus, rough second half of the season dropped them down overall to 28th. Number 27. This is weird. This is admittedly weird, right? Number 27, Vancouver in the first half of the season. Number 27 in the second half of the season is also Vancouver. So Vancouver should be 27th overall, right? Wrong. 27th overall, barely 27th overall, was Ottawa. So because of the points that Ottawa loses here, Vancouver ends up ahead of them over here. Again, it's not by much, but they do end up ahead of them. So Vancouver, it was a rough year. And what I did for Vancouver, because people will know that for 3 weeks during the COVID shutdown, I didn't rank Vancouver. So I just divided their total by 3 less than the 8. So I divided it by 5. And it still ends up 27th overall, which, again, you know, when they came out of that pause, we really wanted to see them get back into it. But I think the highest Vancouver got all year was 18th. I'll be doing a video as well on the highs and lows and on the weeks where where teams were at their best or at their worst. That's another video I'm going to make on how the power rankings work this year and all that. Because honestly, it is fascinating for me. You guys can decide if it's fascinating for you, but it's fascinating to me to see how this works. And again, shows I don't play favorites because the Canucks just were mired in the muck most of the year. Number 26 in the first half was San Jose. San Jose had a rough time of it. Number 26 in the second half of the season was Ottawa. So they finished ahead of Vancouver there. But again, barely. Vancouver finishes ahead of them for 26th on the overall score. So, yeah, there you go, Vancouver. You're 26th overall. Good job. Yeah, and again, it was really, really close. Just I think 1 or 2 points separating them and Ottawa overall. Yeah, Vancouver absolutely could have ended up 27th. But I didn't move anybody around because I didn't feel like me making judgment calls would do anything other than cause more headaches and possibly a nosebleed trying to figure all this out. Number 25 in the first half of the season was Nashville. Nashville had a really rough start to the season. And I think it's easy to underestimate just how poorly they started off their season. But yeah, they were 25th in the first half. 25th in the second half was LA. The LA Kings, you'll notice they're not here. They had a relatively good run here and there, but their overall score by the end of the year isn't that great. Number 25 overall, San Jose. San Jose finishes 25th on the overall picture right here. There's your overall. So San Jose finishes ahead of Vancouver here, and has not shown up in the second half yet. First half, 24th, is the New York Rangers. Rangers had a rough start to the season as well. A rough second half of the season to finish 24th. New Jersey, not a huge surprise there. New Jersey nosedived towards the end of it. New Jersey would have been ranked about 19th if not for that nosedive at the end of it. And overall, number 24, the LA Kings. So LA ends up 24th overall. They're 25th in the second half. And when we get up to 23rd in the first half, that's where we find LA. So LA 23rd, 25th, 24th. Yeah, that's about right. Again, so this is the one playoff team on the board so far is Nashville. Nashville is the one that got off to a really poor start that ends up in the playoffs in the second half of the season. Number 23 in the second half of the season was San Jose. So they had a better second half than first half. They end up 25th overall. 23rd on the overall tote board is New Jersey. And again, what's interesting is, because we always talk about, you know, getting off to a good start and how important it is, I think this kind of shows this as well. That while the Rangers made some noise in the second half of the season and Nashville ends up in the playoffs, in general, if you have a rough start to the season, probably don't make the playoffs. And that cutoff usually in a regular season is around the American Thanksgiving date. And it is just so telling that we are in a league of great parity, but sometimes that parity may not be what it appears. Number 22 in the first half of the season was New Jersey. So they're right there. Number 22 in the second half of the season was the Coyotes. And number 22 overall was the Coyotes. So New Jersey, good first half. Decent second half until, like I said, the bottom fell out. For Arizona, it was just overall a very middling, mediocre season. Better first half than second half, apparently. Although when you get to number 21, it shows it wasn't that much better, because they're 21 on the first half of the season board. So, 21 for Arizona right there. Number 21 in the second half of the season. Boy, you want to talk about a team nosediving. How about Philadelphia? Philadelphia had a brutal second half to the season. A very good first half. And so, yeah, quite the crash for them. Number 21 overall, Dallas. And that was a surprise that Dallas was that low, and yet it was a long year for Dallas. And when they fell out of the playoffs, like once it was obvious they weren't going to make the playoffs, I was kind of relieved just because of how many overtime and shootout loss points they had. And yeah, and then you look at how the playoffs turned out. It's not like they were going to win a round anyways. So for Dallas, it's all better luck next year. Number 20 in the first half of the season was Columbus. Yep, Columbus wasn't too bad that first half of the season. Crashed pretty hard the second half of the season, and it drags them down to 28th overall. Number 20 in the second half of the season was Dallas. So that definitely dragged them down. Number 20 in the overall listing, Calgary. So the Flames, who have yet to show up on the board in the first or second half of the season, are 20th overall because of total points. And this is where I find it just fascinating. This is something I've pointed out before, that, I do my power rankings on Saturdays, and it shows where they're at on that day. But the overall averages, it's not too bad. And no, I'm not going to start doing like ranking them every day and write it down in a book and then average that. And I'm not going to do that. But yeah, Calgary 20th overall. Number 19 in the first half of the season was Chicago. Number 19 in the second half of the season was Calgary. So there's the Flames. The Flames are there. Number 19 in the overall picture was Chicago. Chicago Blackhawks, of course, got off to a really bad start. And then they dug their way back into the race by beating the teams they had to. And then they had a really rough schedule where they were playing against the teams that were ahead of them in the standings. And it crashed pretty quickly. So they made their way up. I think there was 5 weeks in a row where they were climbing. That's another thing I can look at and do a video where I'm, hey, and throw that in with the high-low video of power rankings as well. Which ones climbed the most weeks, which ones dropped the most weeks, which ones were steady the most often, that kind of thing. But yeah, Chicago, it was promising, and then it kind of falls apart, but they're a young team. A lot of good young players in Chicago, so there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about next season. Number 18 in the first half of the season, Calgary. Number 18 in the second half of the season, Chicago. And number 18 overall, the New York Rangers. So again, we have no playoff teams yet showing up on the board. The Rangers flirted with it at points during the season. They have not shown up yet on the second half part of the board because they had a pretty good second half of the season. But yeah, Rangers end up 18th overall. Number 17 in the first half of the season, it was Dallas, who had a really good first couple of weeks, and then once that dive took place, they never really fully recovered from that. Number 17 in the second half of the season is St. Louis, who had that really bad patch there that definitely drags them down there. Number 17 overall, and this is a playoff team at 17th, and that's Nashville. Nashville ends up 17th in part because they were really poor in that first half of the season, so they generated a ton of points there, and they got better in the second half, drags them up to 17th, but we do end up with a non-playoff team in the top 16. So, because they had a really good start to the year and then fell off. Number 16 in the first half of the season, Edmonton. The Oilers had a really rough start to the season, so it took them a while to dig their way out. But, yeah, they end up 16th for the first half. 16th for the second half of the season, Montreal, who had a very good start to the season. Number 16 on the overall list, and this is a non-playoff team, and that's Philadelphia. So the Flyers end up 16th overall because they had a very good first half of the season. You'll see that 21st here for the second half of the season. Drags them down, does not drag them down below Nashville. It's close, admittedly close, but they end up finishing ahead of Nashville overall. So kudos, I guess. number 15 in the first half of the season, and it looked like they might miss the playoffs altogether, was Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh had a rough first half, good second half. 15 in the second half of the season, the Rangers. Again, the Rangers had a good second half. I think it's easy to forget that now with everything that happened with the team towards the end of the season. With all the Tom Wilson, the Panarin, the Dolan deciding to fire people in a public statement. I think it really detracted from just how well they played in that second half of the season. It's too bad. Number 15 overall, and again, it's a magnet that's not matching the other magnets, and that's St. Louis. So the Blues end up 15th overall. I'm fine with that. Of course, they lost in the first round. We have Montreal as the first team on the board that's still playing, right? And that's 16th in the second half of the season. Because, yeah, they had their problems in the second half. They only won 24 games out of 56 this year. So, really not an inspiring season for Montreal overall. But, yeah, they're still playing. Number 14 in the first half of the season, the New York Islanders. It is obvious from the way that the Islanders are playing in the playoffs that they pace themselves. They're not overly concerned with where they're at in the playoffs. They just go out and play their games. And making the playoffs is the key for them. Number 14 in the second half of the season was Nashville. So Nashville goes from 25th to 14th between the first and second half of the season. Very good second half of the season for them. 14th overall is Montreal. So the Habs end up 14th overall, and that's the first top four team, well, of the final four teams that's shown up on the board for the overalls. So we're up to number 13. Number 13 13 for the first half of the season is Minnesota. See, and I've got all these magnets sitting in front of me. I got to remember, keep them all in order and make sure I'm putting the ones in the right spot. And I'm doing pretty good so far. I want to jinx it. Number 13 in the second half of the season, the Islanders. So again, the Islanders 14th, 13th, steady. Overall, 13th, Oilers. So the Oilers end up being 13th overall. Of course, they lost in the first round of the playoffs. They had a better second half than they had first half. But, yeah, 13th overall. Number 12 in the first half of the season, Philly. So like I said, the Philadelphia Flyers, they go from 12th in the first half of the season to 21st in the second half of the season. Rough. 12th in the second half of the season, Winnipeg. Winnipeg had a rougher second half than their first half. 12th overall, because they're very consistent, is the New York Islanders. New York Islanders, their consistency means that their overall score actually ends up with them being 12th, while they were 14th in the first half and 13th in the second half. Because, again, they're gaining points on Philly, they're gaining points on other teams, and, again, to me, that's fine. The Islanders and the Canadiens being the underdogs in the current rounds that they're playing. Number 11 in the first half of the season was St. Louis. Great overall first half numbers, and then it sort of falls apart as we get into this part of the season, right? Number 11 in the second half of the season, a team that had its flutter before we get to the trade deadline, and that's Boston. Boston had problems before the trade deadline. After the trade deadline, things get better. If not for the trade deadline pickups and them getting better, they honestly would have been right around where the Rangers are on this board. Number 11 overall, Winnipeg. So Winnipeg ends up being the number 11 team on the overall board. Good season. Again, they were 12th in the second half of the season. They're 11th overall. So where were they in the first half? The first half, they were actually 10th. 10th spot. So, yeah, Winnipeg had a good year overall. And again, because every now and then I get accused of boldly favoring the Canucks over the Jets. Power rankings would tell me I don't. Yeah, they're only 15 spots ahead of Vancouver on the overall board. So, yeah. In the second half of the season, number 10 overall is Edmonton. So again, yeah, they had the rough playoffs, but regular season. They end up 10th in that second half. And overall 10th was Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh ends up 10th overall. And, yeah, they had a really good second half to the season after what was a rough start to the season. Like I said, there was a point early on where it looked like maybe Pittsburgh doesn't make the playoffs. But they did. Surprise, surprise. Number 9 in the first half of the season was Montreal. Again, Montreal got off to a really good start. I think they were third the first week of the power rankings. And then they dropped, but they end up 9th in the first half of the season. Second half of the season, 9th was Minnesota. So Minnesota was 13th in the first half, 9th in the second half. So where do they finish overall? They actually end up finishing 9th. Consistent throughout the season for the most part. Things look bright if you're a Minnesota fan right now, although losing in the first round may feel familiar. They got to a 7th game. They pushed Vegas pretty far. I think there's a bright future there. Number 8 in the first half of the season was Florida. Florida had a slow start, and it took them a little while, but once they got into the top 10, there was no looking back for them. Number 8 in the second half of the season was Pittsburgh. So again, Pittsburgh 15th in the first half, 8th in the second half, and the overall 8th spot was Boston. So there you go. Because again, to Shannon favor his teams, I have Boston in 8th, Dallas in 21st, and Vancouver in 26th. So I don't see a favorite there necessarily that I'm giving extra points to in power rankings. And yeah, Boston 8th overall, I think that's about accurate. There was definitely some fans who felt like this is going to be Boston's year. This is a big year. And I was kind of, never took Boston to win the Stanley Cup. Number 7, Capitals. The first half of the season, the Capitals 7th. They had their dive. I think the first half of the season was where they dropped to 14th at one point. Number 7 in the second half of the season, Florida. Again, very consistent, right? In that top row or that first column. And number 7 overall is also Florida. So nice, consistent numbers right there. So Bird wants to get the video. So it's a little songbird that comes down and chirps at Bear, and Bear stares at it out the window and it drives her nuts. Kind of funny. But yeah, so Florida, number 7 overall. And now we're into the top 6. Who's excited about the top 6? No, nobody. Nobody's excited about the top 6. What do you mean I should have done this 2 months ago? I thought it was interesting to do this now because we're almost to the Stanley Cup final, right? And see, so the teams that I had higher up on the board, how did they do in the playoffs? That kind of thing, right? So number 6, keeping that in mind, the first half of the season, it was Carolina. Carolina had some up and down patches, but overall they end up 6th. They end up ahead of the Capitals at the end of it. Number 6 in the second half of the season, this is where it gets really interesting. The Tampa Bay Lightning. Yeah, the Tampa Bay Lightning 6th in the second half. Tampa Bay was struggling going into the playoffs. By their standards, struggling. But I had to drop them down because they were losing games. So in the playoffs, they get Kucherov back and things look good. But where are they on the overall board? Because they're not 6th. 6th on the overall board is the Capitals. So you see, you get the Capitals in 6th place, and Tampa Bay is 6th place in the second half. But where are they on the overall? And that was the thing that I looked at last night, and I went, you know what? This is really interesting. Number 5, on the first half of the season, Boston. So Boston, the first half of the season's 5th. Second half, they're 11th, and overall they end up 8th. I did not have Boston first on any power rankings. The highest they got was 2nd. So, yeah, they were never first this year. Last year they were, and the year before they had first place finishes too. So whether or not that means anything, it doesn't. But it's interesting to look at. Number 5 in the second half was Toronto. So see, there's the Leafs. The Leafs are right there. The overall picture, however, Carolina 5th. And again, we can talk about Toronto and how they fall out in the first round and how that went. But they had a very good record. So, I mean, the question then becomes one of, should you punish them for being in a division that other people see as being easy? Or, because again, it's all subjective. But Toronto, 5th overall. Well, no, 5th in the second half. They're not 5th overall. We haven't got to that yet. Fourth in the first half of the season was Colorado. And that was when they went through kind of a rough patch. They still end up 4th in the first half of the season. 4th in the second half of the season was Washington. They were better in the second half of the season. I thought it was impressive how they played without Samsonov, Kuznetsov, Ovechkin, when all of them were out COVID protocols. I thought the Caps played pretty well. And it just doesn't translate to the playoffs, right? Number 4 on the overall board is Toronto. So again, first in the North. Very good regular season. Postseason, they had a 3-1 series lead. Could not close it out. And at the end of the year, they end up being 4th. But, I'm fine with that. That's the number 1 team in the North. They end up 4th on the overall board. That's about right. Number 3 on the first half of the season part of things is Toronto. So Toronto doesn't get first on any of this. Carolina ends up being 3rd in the second half of the season. So for Carolina, 6th in the first half, 3rd in the second half, and 5th on the overall board. So, Carolina, contender? Sure. Number 3 on the overall board, Colorado. Yeah, the Abs end up being 3rd overall. So they're 4th in the second half of the season. Where are they in the second half of the season? third overall. So, yeah, I think that's pretty good. Number 2 in the first half of the season was Vegas. So this is where I'm going to do things a little bit differently. So the Las Vegas Golden Knights ended up being number 2 in the first half of the season. Had a very good very good first half, and there was definitely some complaining that there was preferential treatment on the board given to them, as well as to number 1, which was Tampa. So the Tampa Bay Lightning end up being first on the first half of the season board, and 6th in the second half of the season board. So where did they end up on the overall? Who was second and first on the second half part of the board? And again, I think it's interesting that the first half of the season, the teams that were 1 and 2 are the ones right now, as I'm recording this, are favored to meet in the Stanley Cup final. So yeah, it's just, to me, it's really interesting because we get into this conversation about whether or not these boards matter, and you've got number 9 and number 14 also being in the Final Four, but it's just, I find that interesting. Second half of the season, number 2 was Colorado. Well, we know they're third overall. They're fourth on the first half of the season, so they don't end up finishing first on any of the 3 categories, but they did pretty well. So first in the second half of the season was Vegas. The Vegas Golden Knights, on average, had the best score. And yet, for first place, being first overall, Tampa Bay had the most first place spots of any team on the board. And it's fascinating because they dropped so far by the end of the season that it drags them down to 6th. Whereas if not for that finish, they would have been top 3. But that finish definitely dragged them down, with Toronto, Washington, Carolina, Colorado all having really highly rated teams throughout most of that second half. So, the overall picture. The second place team overall was Tampa. So the Tampa Bay Lightning, despite being 6th, because they were first here and because they had so many first place finishes, they still end up 6th or 2nd on the overall board. This 6th place drags them down to 2nd rather than 1st, which means first place overall was the Vegas Golden Knights. The Vegas Golden Knights, on average, had the best score on the power rankings board of any of the 31 teams during the season. So, yeah, I think that's a fascinating result. I'm glad I threw this together, and I hope you guys are too. And again, the thing that surprised me the most, the surprises really are that Buffalo wasn't 31st. That surprised me. That was not influenced either by Vancouver not being around. I was also mildly surprised that Anaheim ends up being at the bottom for the whole thing. Surprises on the positive side, I don't know. It all seems pretty well right where I thought it would be. First round matchups. See, Nashville ends up out in the first round. Seattle, not yet. Next year there'll be 32 teams, right? Yeah, St. Louis was out in the first round. Of course, they're still in the semifinals, out in the first round, semifinals, second round, first round, second round, first round, second round, first round, second round. So, yeah. Be interesting to see how things turn out from here and whether or not one of the top 2 on the overall ends up actually being the Stanley Cup champion. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Yes, I am still doing power rankings during the playoffs. However, those will be revealed once we get past the playoffs and we're getting set for the draft. I'll do like a power rankings heading into the draft. Not any major changes with the teams that missed the playoffs, of course, but for the teams in the playoffs, I had to rank them by when they get knocked out. So, all right, look forward to that. Again, let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.